Well, good morning. We are kicking off a brand new series today called The Time of Your Life. And I think it's important for us to stop as we begin this series and consider the idea of time. I mean, think about it. How many times have you asked or thought this question in the past week? Anybody do it at least once a day? Maybe, how about let's shoot for 20 times a day? You know, and if you're at the midst of one of those kind of crushing, you got to get stuff done. Maybe it's like, maybe you feel like your life is like this rope, and it's like a to-do list, and you got all this stuff, you got to get the kids. It's summer, so you got to get them off to summer camp. Maybe in the morning, because it's still kind of cool out there, so we get them off to some kind of sports camp, and then after sports camp, we get them to some kind of band, or maybe science class, something in the end, and then you pick them up after school, and then maybe they got a softball game, and then you got your stuff. You got to add up and all that kind of stuff, and you have to know what time it is, because if anything gets out of control, right, it just all gets to be a jumbled mess. Does that sound like life for you? And I'm convinced that one of the greatest temptations and even approaches the devil has in your life, and my life as well, is not so much to get us involved in bad things, but it's simply to get our life so busy, so wrapped up in so much stuff that we really don't have the times to stop and to think. And so what I want us to think about, starting today, but even through the next few weeks, is not the question of what time is it, but rather, what am I doing with my time? And I say that this morning, and I want to give sort of a little footnote to that. When I say that, I don't want you to feel guilty that you're not doing enough with your time. I don't want you to feel like when you were 20, and those of you 20, sorry, but, I don't want you to feel like your parent is looking at you today saying, what are you doing with your time? Are you going to play video games all day long? Are you going to look for a job this summer? Are you going to do anything with your life? That's not the kind of question we're asking today, right? This is not about feeling guilty. It's just simply stopping and stepping back and saying, what am I doing with my time? Instead of what time it is. Because the truth of the matter is, everybody sitting in this room today is equal only in one place of life, in one circumstance of life. Everybody in this room doesn't have the same amount of money, correct? Yeah, nobody wants to jump on that one. All right. We'll go a little harder. Not everybody in this room is as smart as each other, correct? Yeah, look at the ones that said correct really loud and kind of keep an eye on those people, all right? But everybody in this room has the exact same amount of time, correct? Now, we may think, well, no. They got a lot of free time. Everybody has the exact same amount of time. In fact, let's stop for just a second. That second, we all have the exact same amount of time in that second, right? And that second is now gone forever. And that one, as I spoke that, the next second, and the next second, and the next second. Because time has this amazing thing that happens to it. Time, it used to be the song in the 70s, time just keeps on clicking into the future. And it goes to never come back to again. So what? What are you doing with your time? We think about our life start off here when we're born, and life goes along, and, you go to elementary school, and then you go to middle school, and then to high school, and then you decide, am I going to college, or am I just getting a job, and whichever way you go, and you get out of that, and hopefully get a job at some place, and maybe you decide to get married, maybe you don't want to get married, whatever the case is, maybe you get married multiple times because the first one didn't work. Maybe the second one didn't work, or the third one, and you go along, and maybe you have grandkids, and you spend some time with them. You want to get to the point you can retire so you can play golf, and then you die. That sound like anybody's life out here? Kind of the track of most people's life, isn't it? So the question really isn't what time is it, but how much time? What am I doing with my time? Before we kind of jump into it today, I want to invite you just to bow your heads for just a moment and give us all just a few seconds with God, all right? Lord God Almighty, the one who has not only created everything that we see and even the things we don't see, the one who's not only created this environment with just the right amount of oxygen and just the right amount of chemicals and just the right amount of distance from the sun, who's done everything perfectly to create a life for us. but who more importantly has given us time. Time to live, time to think, and time hopefully to give you room in it. And so, Father, just at this moment, I pray that you would use this precious, this sacred time that will happen over the next few minutes to remind us again of who you are and who we are. In your name, amen. Let's go over to some happy thoughts on time from Job. Or Job. I had a friend that wasn't from a Christian background, so maybe it's Job, whichever way you want to pronounce it. Happy thoughts on time from Job. And I know I heard a couple of chuckles. That's because you kind of know that Job is not the most happy guy in life, had pretty tough course in life. Had everything, had it all, had kids and riches, and everything was going great, and then everything went terrible. And it got worse and worse and worse. But I just want to consider, because Job in his midst of sort of experiencing the highs and lows of life, offers us a couple of ideas. Job 7 verse 6 says, "My days fly faster than a weaver's shuttle. They end without hope." How many of you know what a weaver's shuttle is? Yeah, just a couple of us. I had to look it up because I had no clue. I thought a shuttle, is that something that goes in space? A weaver, is it the thing that throws? But no, it's like a sewing machine. It's a little thing that goes like that. And so as fast as that goes, it's sort of how our days go, and they end without hope. Kind of one of those hallmark moments, right? He goes a couple chapters later, it's recorded, he says these words, "My days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy." And so those are our happy thoughts that we're starting with on the idea of time. And I can promise you that it'll get better as the weeks go by. But today, I think it's important for us to stop and recognize that life doesn't always go like we want it to, that time doesn't always turn out like we want to. And from Job's perspective, and for some of us sitting here today's perspective, it seems like it goes quicker and quicker, and then it's gone. How many of you notice that it seems like the older you get, the quicker time goes by? Anybody notice that? Now, you may know this, there's a scientific explanation for that. And that's simply this. If you are 10 years old, 1 year is how much of your life? It's 10% of your life, right? That's a long time. You get to be like 40 years old, and 1 year is like 1/40th of your life, right? That's why it seems to go quicker, because it's a smaller. The older you get, the shorter and shorter a year is in your life. And it's amazing how quick. I mean, how many times have you said in the last month, where did that month go? It just seems like things go by. And that's Job's picture here, is that they just kind of fly by. And the older you get, the quicker they fly by. And the sad thing is, he says, there's no joy. There's no hope in them. Because for Job, there didn't seem to be. He had this terrible disease, and he just kept suffering. And not only did he have to suffer, he had to listen to his wife in his suffering. And listen to his quote-unquote friends in his suffering. And it didn't seem like it was getting any better for Job. So today I want us to do something. I want us to go over to Psalms 90. If you want to turn over in your Bible, if you have a Bible, you can go over there. Psalms are poems or music songs that we don't have the music notes to in our Bible. And most of them are written by, anybody know who most of the Psalms are written by? David, King David, famous songwriter from back then. This one happens to be written by somebody else, by a guy by the name of Moses. You may be familiar with Moses, but this is a psalm that he wrote, and the psalm's kind of poetic. It has a little flowery language to it. But I want us to look at God's larger perspective, because that's really what Moses is going to say. He says, when you look at this whole time of life that we have, there's this larger perspective that God offers us. And that perspective, he says, before we get into what his words are, I'm going to give you a heads up. This is what he's going to tell us. He's going to tell us that context is everything. Context is everything in life. He says, you can start off here, and you're born, and you think, here's my life going along, and I've gotten all this busy stuff, and maybe I'm right here, maybe I'm right here. As I've gotten older, maybe I'm getting down here, and maybe I'm at this stage of life. But somewhere in there, you can think you've got this life, this long life. Maybe your life, you think like this life just kind of goes on and on and on and on. It just like goes and doesn't stop. And Moses will tell us that the context of where we see our life has everything to do with how our life turns out. And Moses is amazingly qualified to give us some advice on time. Because if you know his story, if you don't, let me tell you a quick version of it. Moses, when he's a baby, gets thrown into the river. And he gets thrown into the river because his parents love him. Now, you may be saying, Mike, that doesn't quite sound like love. I'd take a little baby and throw him in the river. But it was a way to try to protect him, because the Pharaoh at that time, the sort of king ruler of that Egypt, was a little concerned that his slaves were getting too many, that the Jewish nation was a little too procreative, let's use that term. They were just kicking out kids left and right, and so at some point you get too many slaves, they take over things. So he said, we're going to fix this. We're just going to start killing babies. And so that's what they did. They started killing babies, and Moses' parents said, we don't want that to happen to our little boy, so they put him out in this little, hid him down in the reeds and tried to hope things went well, and lo and behold, Pharaoh's daughter gets him and raises him as a prince. Pretty cool turnout, isn't it? You go from being a slave to, now I'm living in the big house. Life is good. And life goes pretty good. I mean, actually goes incredibly good for Moses for almost 40 years. And the Bible tells us that somewhere along there, he begins to recognize that while I am a prince in this house, that's not really who I am. That I'm Jewish by heritage. And he begins to see his people suffering, and a couple times he kind of puts himself in a situation trying to fix things and ends up killing people, and it just kind of gets ugly. And so finally he just has to leave, because he's just one guy and he can't do anything about it, but he hates the position he's in. And so he goes from being this guy who's the first 40 years of his life is sort of that one of those movies you have, rags to riches and everything's going wonderful. And at the age of 40, everything flips the other way. And he goes from riches to rags. And the Bible says that simply from that point, for the next 40 years, the section of life that we would probably call today the prime of his life, you know what he does? He raises sheep. He doesn't do it for himself. He goes and gets hired by somebody, and he raises sheep for 40 years. So let's think about a day in the life of Moses would look like for 40 years. You wake up, you watch the sheep. It's nighttime, you go to sleep, and you keep your ears open just in case an animal shows up, but you sleep. Wake up the next day, and you watch sheep, right? Go to sleep. Sheep. Watch. All Moses had to worry about was, what time of the day is it? If it's daytime, I'm watching sheep. If it's nighttime, I'm sleeping with a little bit of ear open, but I'm watching sheep. It's kind of a big contrast, isn't it? You go from being a prince to watching sheep. And it's every day. 7 days a week, month after month, year after year. That's what he does. He watches sheep. Then you remember at the end of that 40 years that God finally says, okay, Moses, enough of the watching sheep thing. You're my man, and I'm going to send you back to Egypt. And there's a whole long story we won't get into, but he goes back, and this psalm comes from that later part of life when he's looked back sort of at his life and he kind of considered all the things that has happened. The great kind of, I've been a prince, the kind of down, I've just been a shepherd with not much purpose in life, to now I have to go back and do what God has asked me to do. And it's in that context we get this statement. Oh, here, I want to stop here. Here, this context of everything I do. If we will begin to view our life in that context, we will discover the point of our life. That's going to be Moses' thing. He's going to say, if we see our life in the context of something greater than ourselves, if we see our life as not just this long, but as this long, in a long course of history, and if we will begin to view our life in that context, we will discover the point of life. Because you know that at some point, it typically happens somewhere in your 20s, maybe early 30s, you figure out something that you couldn't figure out when you were 16, simply because you can't figure out when you're 16. And that is, you are not the point of life. Now, if you're a teenager, maybe early 20s, I'm not trying to offend you this morning, it is reality. At that stage, you are the point of life because you're you, and it seems like everything's about you. But at some point, you figure out, it's not about me, right? And if you never figure that out, you know how wonderful it is to either marry a person like that or to work for a person like that, right? It's all about figuring out the point of life. And that's exactly what Moses is going to talk about. So here we go, I think. Yeah. All right. Moses says, Lord, through all the generations, you have been our home. He's talking about from the Jewish perspective. That God, through all of our generations, you've been our home. You've been our dwelling place. You've been our rock solid. It's like going home again. You go home, and when I go home to see my mom, and she's baking, there's certain foods that when she bakes, it's like, oh man, I am home, There's these cookies that she used to make called German chocolate squares. I can't eat them anymore because they are really rich. When I was a kid, they were just like great, but it's a little past that. But that's kind of dwelling. He says, listen, you have been that rock solid thing for us through all these generations. Before the mountains were created, before you made the earth and the world, you are God, without beginning or end. Some versions will put it this way. Pretend this goes way off there because it doesn't, all right? He says, you are God. Before you made the world, before anything happened here, you were, and you are. From you didn't have any beginning. There's no beginning over here. There is no end over here. It doesn't matter how long we pull, how long we go. There is no end in sight. You just go on and on and on and on and on and on. And he says that's important for us to know. That's one of those context changers. Because your life, sadly to say this morning, doesn't go on and on and on. True? And the reality is nobody sitting in this place knows how much longer you have either. Which is kind of tough. It's like running a race but not knowing where the finish line is at. Do I run it like a marathon? Which I wouldn't run it like a marathon because I don't marathon, I don't run. But I would walk it like a marathon. But I don't. Do you walk it like a marathon? Or do you walk it like, do you run like you're getting out of a house on fire? One requires about 15, good pumps. The other one is like way too long to run, right? So before the mountains were created, before you made the earth and the world, you are God without beginning or end. You turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust. He's talking about God, how God is over things, and it's just sort of this going back. You start like something and you end up like something, this cycle of life. For you, 1,000 years are as yesterday. They are like a few hours. For you, God, 1,000 years is like yesterday. In fact, he says not even like yesterday, it's like a few hours. Some versions will say like a watch a night. It was about 3 or 4 hours. Can you imagine that 1,000 years is like 3 or 4 hours? Like a good afternoon? Like a bad afternoon? Like an afternoon you slept away? Like an afternoon you worked hard? Just like that, for God, that's what 1,000 years is. Just like that. You sweep people away like dreams that disappear, or like grass that springs up in the morning. In the morning it blooms and flourishes, but at the evening it's dry and withered. He says from God's perspective, from this idea that, yesterday was just like 1,000 years, 3 or 4 hours like 1,000 years, from God's perspective, your life and my life is just like, beep, and that's it. Looks good in the morning, but by night, not so good. There's some flies that are like that, they have like a 24-hour life cycle. They're born, they mate, they die, You may know some people like that. I know some people like that. But it's sort of like this, quick, it's over, and that's the totality of it. And Moses, remember again, is trying to get us to see from God's much larger perspective here, the context of everything. And so when we look at our life, the context is not, whoa, look at my good long life here, I got 70 years or 80 years or 90 years, and this is my life. I have a good long life. And Moses says, you may have a good long life, but your good long life may look like that. Actually, it may look a little smaller, but I wanted you to be able to see it today, right? Because it probably looks like, see that yellow spot right there? How many see the yellow spot right there? Because if you do, we might have some opticians or ophthalmologists that may want to look at you, right? But it'd be like that. It'd be like this little bitty spot. Just this little bitty spot in this longer course, not just of life, but of history. Of time that has no beginning and time that has no end. See, Moses' point is not that our lives don't matter. Okay, he's not saying our lives don't matter. Because they're so brief, it don't matter. but that our life here is so brief that we need to see our lives in God's larger perspective. You get that? Because we can think what he's talking about is life doesn't matter. Your life, gone. Who cares? Your life, gone. That's not his point. His point is your life matters, but it only matters as we see our lives in God's larger perspective. Because our lives here are so brief, even though at times it seems like they go on and on and on, they really are brief when you consider all of God's no beginning and no end. Then he makes this switch. And he says 70 years are given to us. Some may even reach 80. Now, this is not some sort of biblical principle that says, okay, that's your choice. You get 70, you may get 80, but that's the end of it. Because we know people live longer than that, right? Sometimes people thankfully live longer than that. Sometimes, if we're honest, sadly, people live longer than that, correct? I mean, one of the things as a pastor, I've had to watch lots of people die, and I've had to watch lots of families through that process. I've had to watch families suffer with people who have sort of outlived their abilities here on this planet in their mental state, but their bodies keep going and going and going. And so when he says 70, this is not sort of prescription, this is what you have. He's just saying, as you look at life, that's kind of what most people get. 7 years, maybe 80, but even the best of these years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear, and we are gone. Again, not one of those hallmark things that you want to send. No, that's not you're going to find on a get well card, right? Get well soon because life don't look so good, But it's an honest look at life, isn't it? And sometimes I believe we have to step back and take an honest look at life. Because we live in a society, and it's not just new to us today, but we live in a society that over and over and over again tells us, your life can be perfect. Your life can have no blips, no speed bumps. Everything can just be wonderful. One good thing after another after another. You raise your hands in the meeting and you don't have any underwear. So, your life can be perfect. And he's not trying to be a downer here and saying, well, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. He's just being honest. That even the best of years are filled with pain. They have trouble. That doesn't take away from being the best. But it's also a reminder to get rid of that myth that life can be perfect without any pain, without any suffering. Because life has those things. And I believe, and we'll talk about this later in a few weeks, I believe that pain has a purpose for us. Because when something hurts, we want to fix it, right? If something doesn't hurt, why bother with it, right? Then he says something very interesting in verse 11. I almost skipped over it because all the scholars have said it's really hard passage to translate. But I figured you're all a very bright group of people here. Talk to some of you, smart people at work. I literally have rocket scientists that come to church here. It's kind of cool. I've never had a church with a rocket scientist before, so it's kind of cool. So I'm going to throw this out because I think you guys can handle it, all right? If only we knew the power of your anger, your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. 70 or 80 years, good stuff is filled with bad. And by the way, if we only knew the power of your anger and your wrath is as great as the fear you do. Kind of a hard thing to understand, isn't it? But here's the implication. It says if we only knew the power of your anger, the implication is we don't know. If we could only see and comprehend, the implication is we don't see or comprehend the power of God, of his anger, of his wrath, of the fear that's due him. Let me do my own translation here. Here's what I think the better translation. If we could see God as he is, we would give him the reverence he is due. And I believe that is Moses' whole point through Psalms 90. That if we could just somehow see God as he is, we would give him the reverence that he is due. But the truth is we struggle with that, don't we? I mean, I struggle with that. How do I, on a consistent, day-by-day basis, give God, see him as he really is, and give him the reverence he's due? Because sometimes stuff comes up. Gets me off track. And when it comes up and gets me off track, it's easy to kind of get sucked into all that and not see God as he is. And that anger and wrath is not directed at us as much as it's a recognition that God is angry and wrathful to all the bad, terrible stuff that happens on this planet. And rightfully so. And at some point, the Bible tells us he'll do something about it. But at this moment, because of all the other stuff, because of all those stuff that is happening and how history is unfolding, God has kind of said, I can't do it at this moment, because the reality is, if God came and wiped out everything that's bad in this planet, you know what would happen? This room would be vastly empty and quiet this morning. I wouldn't be here. You would be here. That if God came back and wiped out everything that was bad, that was sinful, that was off track. Because there's times when I get off track. There's times when it doesn't quite, I don't see God as he is, and I don't give him the reverence that he's due. Then he finishes with these sort of famous words. Teach us, God, teach us to number our days. Teach us because we don't know how to do this. You know, the days kind of sweep by. How many times have you ever said, oh man, I wish I had remembered to do that? It's too late now. And I wish I could have got, if I had more time, I would have done this or I would have done that. But we have a hard time numbering our days. And one of the main reasons is we don't know what that number is. I mean, if God said, okay, Mike, you have 10 years left or you have 50 years left, I'd figure out something, I'd kind of plot for that. I'd pace myself. But what would happen if God said, Mike, you got a week left to live? My life would be dramatically different. I probably wouldn't see any of you this next week. Go doing something. I got to pack it all in that week. So when he says teach that, we don't know how to do this because we don't know what that span of what the numbers is of our days. But he's really shooting at it for God to teach us to live as if our days are numbered. Numbered not in 90 days left, 73 days left, 6 months and 2 days. Not that kind of days are numbered, but that each day counts. Because it does. Because each day, as I said, everybody has the same amount of time, and when a day's gone, it's gone. You ever have one of those days you thought, man, I wish I could go back and do that again? Anybody have that? Man, it was such a good day. This happened and that happened. I wish I could go do it again, but it's gone. But it's interesting because we know how to number our days on certain things. How many of you remember, you ladies, because the guys don't really think about this too much, but the ladies, those of you that are married, how many of you remember your planning for your wedding day? Do you remember somebody could come up and say, hey, when's the wedding happen? And you would say 3 months, 6 days, 18 hours, and 42, you know what I mean? They got it down. And what do you got to do before then? Oh, I got to do this, get the caterer, get the flowers, get everything, blah, 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 blah. The guys are just like, whatever. But you ladies, you know how to number your days, right? Or if you got a big test that's coming up, kind of the final at school, you know what you got to get done for it, right? You know when the time is. You know how to number your days. At least, hopefully, you do by now. You number it, what you need to study and what you need to prep for and what you need to cram for. Or that big project at work. It's coming up, and you know how far off it is because I got to deliver, and it's another 6 weeks and 3 days at noon on that day. I got to deliver, and so I got to get my act together. We know how to do it on these small parts of life. But what would happen if God taught us to do it on our bigger scale of life? And he finishes by saying that we may gain a heart of wisdom. God teaches us to number our days that we can gain a heart of wisdom. This idea of something that has a little sense to it. But more than just brain sense, a heart of wisdom. A heart of how we live life. And I believe if we can do that we'll make better decisions because we'll live like our days are numbered. And that's really what this series is going to be about. We're to live as if our life has a point, and we're not it. Because while our life has a point on this long scale of things, Our life isn't the point of this long scale of things. We look at a God with no beginning and no end. We're to live as if we are a part of a much grander narrative than just life itself. Because the cool thing about being engaged with God is that we become part of His story, not just my story. We become part of a long-going story. I mean, that's why we know about these people like Moses or David, is because they were part of a longer, much longer story that goes on and on and on. Apparently not any longer, but I will leave that. All right. So let me talk to you. I want to do a little challenge as we close today. I was reading a book the other day, and it asked this question: what's the most expensive piece of property in the world? What would you say? Hong Kong? Oh, yeah, all right. Maybe downtown Manhattan, a city block in Manhattan. Maybe it's an oil field in Saudi Arabia. Maybe it's a diamond mine in South Africa. There's some expensive piece of property around here. But the author, as he's writing this, here's what he said was the most expensive piece of property. A cemetery. And he gave this explanation. There you find the unsurpassable value of businesses never started, novels never written, dreams never pursued. Expensive, right? Stuff that was sort of left on the table because he just didn't need to get to it, or it wasn't right at the moment. We spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to do, but little time thinking about who we really are. And so today as we close, I just want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to live in the now. Not to worry about tomorrow or the next day, but just in the now. Because the reality is that now, I just mentioned 5 seconds ago, is gone now. And that now is now gone now. And every time I say now and say it's gone now, it's already gone now by a few seconds, right? And what God really is after is not so much to try to fill more into our lives or to do something that we think is going to be this huge, big deal. It's simply to live as if we're in the now. As if He's in the now with us, because both those statements are true. We are in the now, and He is with us in this now. So I want you to write down just a few things as we close. First of all, to live in the now, I want you to die empty. Sorry, is it right? Die empty. That ought to be everybody's goal in this room. That when we get to the finish, we're done. And there isn't anything left to come out of us. I mean, wouldn't that be a great way to go? I mean, I can tell you as a pastor, it would be a great way to, great thing to be able to say at somebody's funeral. That they died empty. That they left it all on the table, and they consistently did that. But they had enough left from today to get to tomorrow, but they died empty. Second thing is to get out of you whatever is in you of value to others. That's my challenge. Get out of you whatever is in you that is of value to others. Because again, you aren't here just for you. If you believe in God, if you've said, I'm going to be God's follower, then you have to recognize there's something in you that God wants to use that have value to others. And it's not just to be used to put more money in their pocket, but it's to be in a place where you can be God's presence in that place. Third thing, to empty yourself each day. Each day to look at it as that day. And to say, this day I'm going to try to empty myself, not just die empty, but today, get through today, because I won't have today ever again, right? Today will be gone, and it'll be tomorrow. Let me ask you a question. The question I always ask myself is, what are you saving it up for? So I can tell you from experience how this has worked in my life. I used to be a pretty good basketball player. High school, not so much, but college, after college, I'd play a couple times a week. And there was a portion of my life, probably when I was late 20s, early 30s, that I'd go out and play in some games, and I would kind of coast for a little while. Because I was one of the better players on the court, and you can kind of, there's spots where you don't want to take, be the show. So you pass or you kind of float for just that. Then you kick in again, you come back. And I did that for a number of years. In fact, I did that for a number of years till the point when I could kick it back in became less and less and less. And now I look back and I say, boy, I wish I could be back there again. I would have played games much differently. Because those times, they're gone. And folks, today is going to be gone. Just like yesterday's gone. And so to empty yourself each day. Fourth thing, be you. The best way to live in the now is to be who you are. To figure that out, to accept who that is, and just be you. Don't be somebody else. Don't try to mold yourself like somebody else. You can have mentors and all that stuff, but if you're not you, you're letting yourself down, and I believe you're letting God down in the process. Because if God wanted you to be just like somebody else, he would have made them twins, or triplets, or quadruplets, or whatever the next uplet things that are there, I mean, if that's what he wanted, and he wanted a bunch of them, he would have made a bunch of them, right? But apparently he wanted you. I have no idea why, but he wanted you. So be you. Lastly, don't go to your grave with your best stuff still inside of you. Because there's no worse way to live. And I've stood around, the beds of people as they're dying, and I've heard people say, I wish I had done this, I wish I'd done that differently. Most of the time, it has to do with relationships. I hardly hear anybody say, I wish I'd closed one more deal. I wish I'd built one more, nursing home, or I wish I had, done it. Most of it has to do with their families or their friends or their relationships. And you have good stuff in you. In spite of being a sinner that needs grace and God's covering over your life, you have some great stuff in you. And to recognize that, and to not keep it in, but to let it come out. To take that step towards it all. So in closing, let me just say this one more time. I want to challenge you to die empty. And to do that means you die every day. And what I mean by that is that you just get it all out. And if you can get it all out today, and do it tomorrow, and do it the next day, what a better way to live, right? But I know that's a hard thing to do, and it's a challenge to do, and that's why we're going to spend a number of weeks talking about time. How to get out of it, what really God says to get out of it. How to live in a way that's in rhythm with God in this time. But to see ourselves as valuable to God, but not the point of life.